Welcome to the Podkey summary of what's new in WebKit for Safari 27 from WWDC 2026. A lot of these updates are the kind that make the web feel smoother without most people ever noticing why. Safari and WebKit have been quietly fixing long-standing gaps, cleaning up old engine code, and adding some genuinely useful new tools, from better emoji handling and clearer SVG behavior to fully customizable select menus and native 3D models in HTML. There's also a theme running through all of this. Less hacky workarounds, more standards alignment, and a little more respect for how developers actually use these features in the wild. It's a pretty practical batch of changes. One of the nicest fixes here is for emoji input, and it's a great example of a tiny bug that creates very visible weirdness. WebKit now checks when a typed character uses a Unicode code point bigger than 16 bits. When that happens, instead of passing a numeric code into JavaScript that can get mangled, it just delivers the actual character as plain text. That matters because the old behavior could truncate emojis and turn them into completely wrong symbols, which is not exactly the vibe anyone wants when they're just trying to type a smiley face. What's especially nice is that this fix doesn't force developers to go back and replace old legacy from char code usage everywhere. Existing sites keep working, and users can reliably type any emoji without the whole thing falling apart. There's also a massive internal rewrite of the old block and inline layout algorithm. This is one of those browser engine topics that sounds obscure until you remember how much of the web is built on layout edge cases. The original code had been around for about 2 decades, and WebKit rebuilt it with a new architecture, instead of just layering more fixes on top of the old tangle. Most developers will never look at a page and say, wow, that's a beautiful block and inline rewrite. But they will benefit from fewer strange bugs, more predictable rendering, and a better foundation for whatever layout features come next. It also cuts maintenance overhead for the WebKit team, which usually means fewer hours spent babysitting ancient code and more time shipping useful things. A smaller but important standards fix landed around SVG radial gradients. SVG1 had fuzzy wording around the default values for the fx and fy attributes, which meant browsers could interpret the focal point differently. SVG2 now spells those defaults out clearly, and WebKit adopted that clarified behavior. So gradients should render more consistently across Safari and other browsers instead of wandering off into browser-specific interpretations. That update is part of more than 75 SVG improvements in Safari 27, which honestly is the sort of steady cleanup work the web needs more of. One story here I really like is the CSS random function scoping change, because it shows a browser team listening instead of digging in. At first, named random values were scoped per instance, so each element got its own random number, even if it referenced the same named value. After developers pushed back, Safari 26.5 changed the default to global scoping. That means all elements can share the same named random value by default, which is often what people actually expected when they reached for it. The change happened after CSS working group discussion, and it's a good reminder that standards work is often less about one perfect first draft and more about adjusting once real usage starts revealing what feels intuitive. Safari also closed an annoyingly specific but very real compatibility gap around the HTML sizes attribute. Safari added sizes back in 2014, then later added CSS min and max in 2018, but didn't support using min and max inside sizes. So the pieces existed, but not together, which is very on brand for web platform history. That gap finally got fixed in Safari 26.4. It brings the behavior in line with the spec, and should also cut down on repeat bug reports from developers wondering why clamp style logic wasn't working there. Safari 26.4 also shipped CSS grid lanes, which lets developers build masonry-style layouts using CSS grid syntax instead of bolting on JavaScript layout tricks. That's useful for the classic uneven card wall look, but it goes a bit further too. It supports reverse direction layouts, and Safari includes inspector tools like order numbers to help fine-tune tab navigation order. So this isn't just about making Pinterest-style layouts easier. It also expands what Grid can do in more practical, accessible interface work. One of the flashier additions in Safari 27 is a customizable select element. And if you've ever tried to style a native select and ended up bargaining with the universe, this one probably jumps out. Safari now supports appearance. Base select along with new pseudo elements like picker, checkmark, and picker icon, so developers can fully style the native select control while keeping the built-in accessibility behavior. You can also put extra HTML inside options, including things like subtext or images, and use layout systems like Flexbox or Grid to design drop-downs that look nothing like the default control. That's a pretty big deal, because custom drop-downs have often meant rebuilding basic form controls from scratch, and then spending way too much time trying to recover the accessibility you just lost. On the more futuristic side, the HTML model element is expanding beyond Vision OS and is now available on iOS, iPadOS, and macOS. The new model element lets developers embed 3D models directly in HTML with attributes like environment map and stage mode, which makes the whole thing feel much more native to the web platform instead of living off in a separate universe. There's also an immersive API that works a lot like the full-screen API. On Vision OS, that means a website can move into an immersive mode where a user can step inside the model or view something like a virtual theater seat. Even if that's not everyday website territory yet, it's a clear sign of where browser capabilities are heading, especially as spatial and 3D experiences get treated more like first-class web content. And finally, on the extension side, the cross-browser web extension story keeps getting more practical. Since Safari 14 added support and the W3C Web Extensions community group has kept pushing the standard forward, developers have increasingly been able to maintain one extension codebase that runs across Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. The especially helpful part here is packaging. Safari's web extension packager now lets developers package and submit extensions to the App Store from any operating system, so they no longer have to go through Xcode on a Mac just to get the job done. That removes a pretty concrete barrier. And those boring workflow barriers are often the exact things that decide whether support for a platform happens at all. Taken together, these updates feel less like one giant headline, and more like a browser team steadily making the platform less fragile, less inconsistent, and a lot less dependent on weird workarounds. Some of it is shiny, some of it is deeply unglamorous, and honestly, the web needs both. If your drop-down looks better, your masonry grid stops needing duct tape, and your emoji stays an emoji, that's a pretty solid week. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.